Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jason Wright, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of the History Center. And I want to thank each and every one of you for coming to this solemn occasion. It was just 100 years ago, almost at this time, that there was the greatest industrial loss of life here in Cedar Rapids. And this is our opportunity to remember. Now, we're going to have our ceremony. And then after the ceremony, those of you that would like to take a walking tour with our board member Rob Cook around this area that was so devastatingly impacted by the blast, Cameron, raise your hand. He'll be selling tickets right about over there right after our ceremony. And now, without any further ado, won't you please help me welcome City Council member and, more importantly, History Center board member Susie Wynot.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for joining us here this evening as we remember the National Douglas Starch Works disaster, and most especially those who lost their lives. I'd like to offer up this proclamation on behalf of my colleagues from Linn County Supervisors. Whereas the explosion of the Douglas Starch Works plant in Cedar Rapids, Iowa at 6:30 p.m. on May 22nd, 1919 was the largest industrial disaster, levying nearly all of the 10-acre starch plant and catastrophic loss of life in Linn County to date. 43 workers and 1 civilian. And whereas the force of the explosion caused damage across Cedar Rapids, breaking windows, toppling chimneys, and breaking support beams, the concussion felt as far away as Mount Vernon and Ely. And whereas firefighters and rescue workers searched the wreckage of the plant for days, battling fires left behind by the explosion, while Red Cross and community aid workers offered up support for the disaster victims and their families. And whereas the history of the Douglas Starch Works disaster provides an occasion to reflect on the honorable duties of individuals, societies, and governments when faced with disaster of devastating proportions. And whereas we, the people of Linn County, should always remember the tragic events of the Douglas Starch Works disaster and remain cognizant of community support in times of destruction and tragedy. And now, therefore, be it resolved, I, Susie Wynot, Cedar Rapids Mayor Pro Tem, on behalf of my colleagues, the Linn County Board of Supervisors, do hereby proclaim Wednesday, May 22nd, 2019 as National Douglas Starch Works Disaster Remembrance Day in memory of the victims of the disaster and in honor of the survivors, as well as the rescuers and community members who came together in trying times to support one another. Thank you. So that proclamation gave you an overview, and now I want to give you some more granular information and more detail about what actually happened that day in our community. Today, May 22nd, 2019, marks the 100th anniversary since the Douglas Starch Works explosion. The Douglas Starch Works plant, located on 1st Street Southwest, next to the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad and the Cedar River, covered an area of approximately 10 acres. It consisted of 36 buildings, most of which were built of brick and reinforced concrete, with a few smaller wooden structures. At 6:30 p.m. on May 22nd, 1919, an explosion erupted from the Douglas Starch Works plant, leveling nearly all of the buildings at the site. As a result of this explosion, 43 workers lost their lives, and hundreds were injured. Property losses from the disaster exceeded $3 million. The explosion at the Douglas plant was the most disastrous of its kind that had occurred in the United States up to that point. All evidence obtained from investigations pointed to the fact that a fire preceded the explosion. While the cause of the fire could not definitely be established because of the extent of the destruction, the available evidence clearly indicated the fire originated in the dry starch section of the plant and resulted from the ignition of starch dust. The explosion that resulted from the starch fire toppled buildings and threw wreckage outward. Tree limbs were blown down and the building wreckage was hurled high into the air, in all directions. Parts of the starch works buildings were found over 2 miles away from the scene of the explosion. A number of men trying to escape the explosion were hit by falling debris, while other workers were buried alive with no hope of escape. Some men pinned down under debris were rescued by firefighters who arrived on the scene. The less fortunate of the workers were caught up in the heat of the blast, incinerated where they stood. What remained of the plant was a mass of wreckage. The brick and concrete walls had crumbled, littering the area with piles of stone. Steel supports, conveyors, and piping had become one huge tangled mass, twisted into barely recognizable shapes by the force and the heat of the blast. The force of the explosion was so great that the large divine dryers full of starch had been pushed completely off their foundations, and mechanical dust collectors were hurled several feet from their original locations. Considerable damage was done to public and private property throughout the city of Cedar Rapids by this explosion. The greatest force of the explosion seemed to have been directed northeast up the river. The swinging doors, including door jambs, had been blown across the vestibule into the operator's desk at the entrance of the main office of the Douglas plant, 1 block from the factory buildings, causing considerable damage. Many of the houses and buildings in the immediate neighborhood of the explosion were completely ruined. About 300 yards from the explosion, considerable damage was done to a new factory building which had just been accepted from the contractors the morning of the explosion. There was scarcely a business in the city that did not suffer the loss of broken plate glass windows. Firefighters and rescue workers labored around the clock for days, trying to clear the wreckage and recover those workers lost in the debris. Nearly 6,000 feet of water hose and 7 streams of water were used to battle the fires that consumed the plant. Red Cross volunteers and other community members offered their support to rescue workers and firemen by providing food and care for those who needed it. Those searching the ruins were faced with daunting tasks, suffering burns, smoke inhalation, and injuries from minor explosions that occurred around the disaster site. The ruins of the plant retained much of the heat from the explosion, damaging rescue workers' shoes with the intense heat. The Red Cross and other community organizations coordinated relief efforts to provide replacement shoes for rescue workers, as well as provide for those in the community that were displaced from their homes or lost family to this disaster. The community's response to those impacted by the disaster demonstrated compassion and generosity as people offered up their homes. And they offered food, clothing, and labor for the families of those who perished in the explosion and those injured or displaced by the blast. I would stand here today to say that I don't believe that Cedar Rapids has ever lost their compassion, their generosity, and we step up and we make it happen and we always rise. But I'd like for us at this moment to remember 100 years ago and take a moment in silence as the names are read in remembrance of those whose lives were lost during this tragedy 100 years ago today. Dewey Allnut, Eugene J. Baker, Howard Berry, Rib Bledsaw, George Costello, John Chrisellis, George Koldasek, Joseph W. Koldasek, George Cypress, Harvey E. Eckert, Peter Erickson, Mike Izakula, Samuel Getz, Claude J. Hahn, David C. Hartman. John Hatzikis. Charles J. John. Gus Caleres. J. Clemish. Joseph Christina Jr. Joseph Christina Sr. Ivan Kubakovsky. William D. Liebarger. John Martinek. James E. Newbold. Harry Ormiston. George Pappas. Philip C. Pfeiffer. Everett Prentice. Percy Ramsell. William Rush. Emil Schmidt. Mike Schultz. F. Statsnick. Peter Stencil. John Talliot. Alfred Thomas. Mike Trialanis. Charles F. Treble Jr. Mike Sieberhaus. Joseph Baberka Jr. C. Bopolka. Orville Watson. And Infant Miller.
Won't you please help me thank Susie Wynot for helping us today. There's a beautiful exhibit at the History Center. If you haven't seen it yet, please come. It's touching, it's moving. It tells this story that Susie just so well told in even greater depth. It's at the History Center now for about 9 more months. Please do come and see it. And now, Cameron is just setting up. For those of you that would like to come on the walking tour, you can sign up with him over there. And I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your important and busy days and schedule to remember this solemn and very sad occasion. Thank you for coming.